and we are going to listen to Professor Satterthwaite, who is going to speak about federations of urban poor in the global south. This is a very important topic, and it's a very pertinent topic in the context of the course we're taking. And it's about contemplating how cities are very important sites for mobilization of citizens. So, and cities have always been these important arenas for collective mobilization. And today, more than ever, we see this happening in a range of cities across the world. And cities in the global south are no exception. And we see that there's an increasing number of organizations emerging. They're not necessarily studied from outside or from the north, but that urban citizens themselves organize collectively around a range of issues. On top of that, many of them are also scaling up their organizations, becoming national federations and stretching their links across international space to other grassroots of organizations in other countries. And Professor Satterthwaite, he has lots of experience. He has worked for a long time on these kinds of organizations. He has very close linkages to several of them, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his experience in this area. He is also an academic. He's the editor of a very well-known academic journal called Environment and Urbanization. It's been around for some decades now.
Like me.
Yeah. And he's one of those that's capable of bridging policy and research. So he has been advisor to the urban unit of CEDA when it existed. And he has been advising a range of international organizations, including those working on urban even settlements, like the UN Habitat, which you've heard about. He has also been engaged in assessments of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we'll have the chance of talking a little bit about that later on today. And was part of the team honored with the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize in 2007 around that work. In addition, in 2004, he was also awarded a Volvo Environmental Prize. And I could go on and on, actually, because he's had such an active and impressive career on these very important issues. Professor Satterthwaite is a senior fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development in the UK. And he has, as I've suggested, done research for a long time on issues generally dealing with urban poverty, urban development, urban environmental sustainability, and issues relating to urban citizenship. And with no further delay, I'm really pleased to welcome you, and we're very happy that you could come and visit us at the Department of Image Geography here in Stockholm. So the floor is yours.
I don't know how many of you noticed, but my surname is actually Scandinavian in origin. Satterthwaite means a clearing in the forest for winter pasture. And it was the 8th century invasions from Scandinavia into England looking for land that pushed north and created all these little villages. And Satterthwaite is the name of the village I came from. And when I worked with Swedish CEDA, I tried to convince them that actually I was a Swedish citizen, because you get access to funding much more easily. But they said that the 9th century precedent was a little bit too early. Okay, the rules of engagement stop me at any moment if I'm unclear. If I use the 58th acronym that's driving you crazy, or if I'm speaking too fast. You can also object to what I say, but I would prefer you to keep the slashing critique till the end. But if you really can't resist, I'm very happy to have you put your hand up and say, no, that's wrong, or whatever. And I've been very privileged to work with organizations and federations of slum dwellers, of shack dwellers, of homeless people for the last 20, 25 years. And they've probably taught me more about how cities operate and about risk and vulnerability, which of course is a critical issue for the IPCC, than anyone else. And what is amazing is that over the last 20 to 30 years, more and more nations have federations of savings groups where women have the dominant role, both in management and at the foundation. And these are driving, pushing new urban policies, new urban practices in many nations. They've deliberately become an international network too, as they work together, as they visit each other, as they learn from each other, even as they agree to finance each other. So this is really the bigger story of which I'm going to give you some small part. But of course, why is it relevant? 1 in 7 of the world's population lives in informal settlements like that. 1 in 7 of the world's population. Can I put this light on? Because I can't actually see what I'm saying.
At the base of it.
At the base. Swedish lights always have these ingenious switches that you can't find. I also have a theory, the more expensive the hotel you're put in, the more difficult it is to find the light switches. But that's 1 billion people, not only living in informal settlements like this, but 1 billion people with no records, with no documentation, that don't exist in government regulations. How do you begin to put in infrastructure there, to put in services there, if you have no official documentation? If you don't know who lives there, you don't know what their livelihoods are, you don't know what infrastructure is available, what services are there. What I would like to cover in this presentation is how grassroots organizations and then the federations they form are beginning to challenge government in a whole range of ways, but especially around their exclusion from infrastructure and services. How these federations develop from local savings groups. All the savings groups are dominated by women. Men aren't excluded, but it means that as the federations of savings groups form, so women have leadership positions in the federations. Makes them unusual. How they've formed their own international network. How many of you have actually looked at the website of Slum Shack Dwellers International? Oh, a few of you. So I'm glad to see that it's generating interest. And what I want to do is I want to concentrate on one of the tools that the federations use as they seek to drive poverty reduction, and that is around enumerations and mapping of their own informal settlements. Finally, it's also worth reflecting on having representative organizations of the urban poor mean that it's not an NGO, it's not an academic that's always asked to bring the urban poor's position. I've been in this business 40 years. Participation always seems to mean getting an NGO representative to come and talk about the needs of the poor. No one ever invites grassroots organizations to come to CEDA, to DFID, to the World Bank, to talk about their needs and priorities. It's always some professional that's asked to represent them. As these organizations develop their own representative structures, so they have their own kind who represents them, not an NGO. This evening I'm going to a conference in Uppsala where it isn't only people like me talking about them, it's 2 or 3 grassroots leaders that are coming to talk about their work. That's an important change. No longer do they have to rely on others to talk about their needs and push their particular agendas. But go back to that first picture. How difficult it is to actually generate documentation for that. Many of the cities I work in, half the population live in informal settlements. Mumbai, half the population in informal settlements. Dar es Salaam, 70% of the population in informal settlements. Nairobi, 50% of the population in informal settlements. Delhi, 45%. Dhaka, 50, 60%. How do you begin to identify who lives there, to actually establish the basis for understanding their needs and their particular priorities? Most governments will turn to census data, but it's unlikely that those that did the censuses actually go to these informal settlements. If they do, certainly they don't cover the whole of the population. And of course, in a well-functioning city, utilities have details about each household. The water utility, the electricity utility, of the local government. But again, in informal settlements, they have no water connections, they have no electricity connections. So there is no data about them from which you begin to plan, to assess their needs. How do you do a map and a survey in an informal settlement where there's no street names? How do you build a sample frame if you're doing a household survey, if you have no records of individuals or households who actually live there? It's actually very difficult to generate data about informal or illegal settlements. Of course, moving to my work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, how do you map risk and vulnerability? The first thing you look for when you're looking at risk from extreme weather is careful records of past extreme weather events, who was impacted, where they lived, what happened to them, did their houses get damaged? In informal settlements, you have none of those records. So how do you begin to build a picture of how you address risk and vulnerability in those settlements? And of course, if you talk to organizations that do household surveys, if you were employed as one of the people doing the interview, you'll be given a strict schedule of questions and a time budget. Don't spend more than 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes in each household, otherwise it becomes too expensive. How can you do a professional survey in a city that has 1,000 informal settlements? Even Cuttack, a relatively small city in India, 600,000 people, has 331 different informal settlements. How could the government find the time and the expertise to document each of those? And of course, once you go into an informal settlement, there's people that don't want to be documented. In Nairobi, in many of the main informal settlements, there's large-scale landlordism. It may be an informal settlement, it may look like shacks, but actually it's very powerful Kenyan middle and upper income groups that took over the land illegally and are renting out these small one-room shacks, making a lot of money on it. And the last thing they want is someone coming and carefully detailing their illegal use of that space for rent. Those engaged in illegal occupations, brewing alcohol, for instance, they don't really want a formal survey of what they're doing. Immigrants, illegal immigrants perhaps, don't want anyone coming and documenting their land. So not only is it quite difficult to do so from the basis of methodology, it's quite difficult to do so because the people there, or many of the people there, don't want to be documented. And then there's all the bigger issues around the documentation you need to actually exercise your rights as a citizen. You see, I have a date of birth. I prefer you not to look at how long ago it was. I have my electricity statement. These are important for getting access to state entitlements. I have my University College London pass, I have my passport, I have a senior rail card, which gets me cheap rail things, and I have my driving license. Now again, all of these are useful for getting entitlements, for getting bank account, for opening an account with an electricity company, when you move to a new home, opening a water account. We take for granted these various forms of identity that we have, that we use to prove who we are, which then gets us access to services and to entitlements. Imagine that you have none of those. Without a legal address, you may not be able to get on the electoral roll. Without a legal address, you may not be able to get your kids into government schools. It's funny, private schools, one associates with elite, but very large numbers of low-income urban dwellers send their kids to private schools because they can't then get them into state schools. They can't get them into state schools because they've got no proof of legal address. Very difficult to open a bank account if you have no legal address and no formal documentation. Without documentation about your right to live in that house, very difficult to protect yourself from eviction. It's very often those without legal documents that get evicted, often with no compensation. I think you can still get this on the web. This is an amazing document. This is a census of pavement dwellers. No one ever counts the pavement dwellers. No census covers the pavement dwellers. You go to Mumbai, you go to an area like Baikala, And this is a normal street, and here is a little pavement, and here are houses that start off this high and go down like that, and are about that wide, about that deep. And those are formal pavement dwellers' homes. Sometimes they have 2 stories. They're still only this high, but they have a floor here so you can fit a sewing machine and someone squashed in there doing work. And then in the bottom they have all the cooking utensils. And I go every 6 months to work with the Federation in India, and I've got to know many of these women pavement dwellers, and they'll proudly show you their house. And you'll ask, how many people live there? Oh, 12 people live there. 12 people live there in a house that's less than 1 square metre. These are a very important part of the city economy in various areas of Mumbai. They are the cheap labour. All the women pavement dwellers are employed. They're not unemployed. They're not recent rural migrants. They've been there 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Some were born there. But no one knows about them or their needs or their priorities because they're never included in any survey, any document. What this remarkable NGO sparked in 1985 was to sit with each of the pavement dwellers and record who they were, where they lived. And they created maps showing where each pavement dweller lived. As soon as you had a map where it showed the pavement dwelling, you could go to the local authorities and say, I have an address. And it was on the basis of this census, the basis of this map, that they got entitlement to ration cards. And they got recognised as having right to housing. It shows a clever way of them creating their own database through which to negotiate inclusion into normal government services. Doing surveys, doing enumerations, doing maps has become a standard part of the practice of the federations of slum dwellers, federations of shack dwellers, federations of homeless people. It becomes a way of establishing their legitimacy, demonstrating who they are, where they live, documenting the infrastructure that they have, and doing the map that allows the basis for bringing in water mains, sewer mains, drains, emergency services, for incorporating them into the formal city. All the federations have an autonomous capacity to act, but all the federations choose to try and negotiate with local government. In the end, if you're very low income and you live in a major city, you need to work with local government. You can't work outside them. You don't have the political strength for autonomous capacity. Of course, the scale and scope of what they can achieve enormously increases when local government works with them. In many of the federations now, there's strong partnerships with local governments. And the federations in many nations are building hundreds of houses at this moment. Cheaper, better quality, larger than contractors, because they've developed a relationship with local government, and local government has granted them land on which to build. And it's just worth remembering that these are mass movements. The National Slum Dwellers Federation has 2 million members. Right? You don't monkey with an institution that has that many members. You have to at least align to some extent with them if you want to get the low-income vote. The National Slum Dwellers Federation is allied to Mahila Milan. Mahila Milan is the network of women savings groups. There was a decision that the National Slum Dwellers Federation was really male-dominated, had women members, but there was an agreement that a separate women-only organisation was important to make sure that women's needs and priorities drove the policies and the practices, and the two worked very closely together. In Thailand, very unusually, you had a national government agency that gives support direct to grassroots organisations and networks, and that has enormously increased the scale of what is possible. South Africa, you've got the South African Federation of the Urban Poor. The acronym for the federation is Fed Up, which annoyed the hell out of the minister, which perhaps is what grassroots organisations have to do. In Zimbabwe and Kenya, urban poor federations, you see the pattern. In almost all cases, there's the federation, and then there's a small support NGO that works very closely with them. The support NGO has to be careful not to take over policy. Federations drive policy. Federations drive the change. The NGO, though, is to support them, not to lead them. Then you've got strong federations of the urban poor in Brazil, around Sao Paulo. Cambodia, expanding very rapidly. Ghana, expanding. Namibia, almost national coverage. Nepal, having some problems. Malawi, expanding very much what it's doing. The Philippines, expanding what it's doing. Sri Lanka, consolidating. Tanzania, Zambia, and Uganda. There's also many other nations where federations are beginning to emerge. All you need to be part of the federation are savings groups that practice what's called daily savings. It means that, say you were a single savings group and I was your manager, very unusually because it will be a woman who would manage it. I come to each of you every day and I ask them, do you want another loan? How's your savings going? What about the repayment you promised? And that individual relationship with each of your savings group members happens every day. That means it's very easy to save very small sums, the change you've got left in your pocket at the end of the day. And that then builds the savings groups. The savings groups then federate, they join together, they visit each other, they learn what each other's doing. And then you begin to get not only women's savings groups, the pavement dwellers here, the slum dwellers there, another set of slum dwellers there, you get a citywide federation. They join together. I'm going to leave this presentation so you can get copies of it, so I'm not going to go through the detail, but that's just a reminder of the federations, the date when they started, the cities where the federations are active, the number of active savers, the savings, which is very considerable. These are the poorest groups in these cities. The houses built and the tenure secured. That's the number of households who've secured tenure. You can see the pretty considerable scale in some of the federations. This doesn't include Thailand, which is actually the biggest program, because that has a slightly different model. It's a government institution that's providing loans direct to grassroots organisations that organise, so that it's part of Slum Shackles International, but it has a slightly different methodology. You can't really report in the same way. The federations made a choice to work with local government. The key leader, Jokin Aporthan, the head of the National Slum Dwellers Federation, fought for 20 years against the government of India. He was imprisoned 43 times. He was threatened with death and had to go into exile briefly. But his reflection after 20 years of fighting, of mobilizing, of organizing is that you're never going to win the fight through political force. You've got to make local governments see you as people with competence, people with capacity, people with legitimacy. You've got to form partnerships with local government. Now, this is quite a historic change from the conventional way in which social movements have demanded their rights in pretty much all countries. And it doesn't mean that they won't protest if needed. But what they're trying to do is to make local governments see them as partners. They have some very influential allies. I don't know how many of you would recognize who that is. Most of you recognize who it is? Yes?
Prince Charles.
Okay, who's the most important person in the photo? Jokin Aporthan, the head of the National Slum Dwellers Federation. It was rather nice. Prince Charles, who has a bit of a social conscience, wanted to come and see this very famous informal settlement in the middle of Mumbai called Dharavi. And Jokin has his offices there. And so Prince Charles turned up. Jokin is an amazing character. If you want to see a story of his life, we published it in Environment and Urbanization in 2008. And this is the story of a slum dweller, of how a slum dweller became a leader, and how a leader became a national leader, and how they mobilized the National Slum Dwellers Federation and what they did. It's an amazing story. But Jokin showed Prince Charles round Mumbai, round Dharawal. And Jokin is never very good at remembering protocol, so he grabbed Prince Charles's hand, you're not allowed to do this, and took him through the network of back alleys. And these security guards at the back lost him. For 15 minutes, Prince Charles was lost in the most notorious slum in Mumbai, with the entire British government freaking out that the heir to the throne was never going to be seen again. And he appeared 15 minutes later, very happy, having been shown really what this informal settlement was like. I think they probably sacked the security guards. This may have frozen. Okay. Before I talk about the enumerations in more detail, just to remind you of the other tools and the methods they use. Savings is one of them. It's very powerful to go and... I occasionally go early in the morning, and I go with the woman who goes round talking to everyone in her savings group. And you go with her and you see how the whole thing operates. And people got interested in this. So one day they got a phone call saying, could they give a presentation to this person, this VIP that was visiting? And they agreed, and the VIP turned up, and with 5 cars. And he was about that tall. And he said he was a very busy man, so he only had 10 minutes. This is the story told to me by the women in pavement prize. So they took him and showed him their house, and were very amused by the fact that he was actually taller than their house. And they gave him tea, and they explained how they did savings, and how the savings were recorded. And he stayed 2 hours. And the story as told by the women in pavement dwellers was, it was so funny because he had all these people around him who were talking on mobile phones the whole time, and chattering and chattering and chattering. Of course, it was Colin Powell, at that time the Foreign Secretary of the United States government. But of course, the reason everyone was speaking on the phones was that he was only meant to be there 10 minutes. And he stayed 2 hours, and therefore they had to put back the meeting with the President, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance. It is very engaging. The federations are very open to people coming and seeing how they operate, as one of the ways of creating influence. They build model houses. When they get land, the critical thing is, how can we build what we want as cheaply as possible? And of course, the smaller the unit, the better you have to design it. So what they do is they construct wooden frames and use materials, and then experiment, change the design, change the layout. It means that they've got a full-size model they can walk into and imagine as the house they're going to build, and get the design right. And of course, as they hold these house modeling exercises, they invite local politicians, local civil servants, local academics to see this process. And of course, once you've got a mock-up like that, it's much easier then to estimate exactly the building material costs. What the federations can do is they can build better quality houses than contractors at about half the price. So if they can negotiate access to land, they've demonstrated this amazing capacity to build good quality houses cheaply. They can undertake pilot projects to learn, to demonstrate. In Mumbai, one of the great problems in the informal settlements is that there's no room for toilets in people's houses. So you rely on public toilets. But the public toilets built by the municipality are not maintained. There usually isn't enough water going to them, and they are awful. No one uses them after about 3 to 4 months. So the women's savings group in one of these informal settlements said, why don't we try to build our own community toilet, and we'll manage it ourselves. Okay. Go to the municipality, they weren't interested. So they got funding from abroad, and they built 2 and then 3 community toilets. Designed by them, built by them, managed by them. Suddenly they could then bring politicians and civil servants to see what they'd done. So instead of coming to you saying, trust us, we'll build a decent toilet, you say, come and open the toilet that we built, and then they get the complete costing of how much everything cost. Suddenly local governments see them as people that can build and manage community toilets. Now, to cut a long story short, There's 1 million informal settlement dwellers in Mumbai that now rely on the community toilets and washing facilities that were designed, built and managed by these grassroots organisations. Now, of course, they had a little technical support, but it needed very little technical support. Very quickly, the women leaders developed the capacity to do all the work themselves. It's a very clever way. You show what you can do, and then you negotiate resources to multiply 20-fold what can be achieved, or 100-fold what can be achieved. This is a methodology used by all the federations. You have lots of local exchanges. Savings groups go and visit each other. A savings group over there has got a particularly nice community toilet, everyone visits it. A savings group down here has developed the use of roof tiles that are half the price of conventional roof tiles. Go and see it. This also happens internationally. In South Africa, they developed Adobe blocks, which the Malawian Federation thought, oh, we could use this would halve the cost of our housing. But they had to get the agreement of the city government, which was difficult because Adobe blocks were illegal. But they got it, and the Federation then could produce houses, halving the cost of bricks. They visit each other to see what government is doing. In Namibia, in Windhoek, the city planners agreed to lower the minimum lot size. If you can halve the minimum lot size, you halve the price of land. They agreed to reduce the infrastructure standards. So instead of demanding that all legal plots had water and sewer connections, they were allowed to draw on local water resources, build community toilets, and upgrade over time. So suddenly what you did was the official, formal, legal housing plot was 1/5 of the cost that it had previously been. Suddenly a large slice of the Homeless People's Federation households could afford a formal housing unit sanctioned by the government. Now, that's very unusual. So, in Kenya, they were trying to get local government to change their mind on similar issues, and they couldn't. So they took the head of Kenya, head of Nairobi's urban planning, took him to Windhoek and showed him what they'd done. So what the federations are doing is they're not only using their own innovation to teach each other, they're using other federations' innovations to teach their governments how to do it. So these international exchanges often have politicians and civil servants as well as federation members. But to go back to the enumerations, it may be dangerous for community organisations to do surveys. The data may be used against them. The data may be used to legitimate their bulldozing. And also, who's going to trust savings groups? Who's going to trust women? Who's going to trust illiterate women to do something that's profoundly professional? Censuses, household surveys, and GIS-based mapping. But the federations have found it very useful to generate this data and to provide it to local authorities. And there's so many different reasons for why it's important. Sometimes it's data for negotiating inclusion. In South Africa, in India, it's been very difficult to convince local authorities to allow so-called slums to be upgraded incrementally. If you're living in an informal settlement, probably in quite a good location, what you want is not a nice house 30 miles away, but your existing home upgraded with water, with sanitation, with drainage. In Latin America, this understanding is 30, 40 years old. In Africa, it's been much more difficult to get that understanding. If you provide details of every household and every house, you have the basis for negotiating upgrading on site rather than rehousing them elsewhere. Enumerations also help you avoid eviction. There was this enormous informal settlement called El Fadama in Accra. 85,000 people. Government wanted to clear them. But when they did their very careful enumeration, they demonstrated that the enormous bus depot and the enormous market that are walking distance of El Fadama would collapse. The survey demonstrates the importance of the labour in informal settlements to the city economy. That then makes local governments more loath to bulldoze them because it would mean a massive disruption to the city economy. I remember many years ago talking to an Indian civil servant, and he was saying, you know, David, all these people in informal settlements, they're all rural migrants, they're all unemployed. They should go home. We don't need them. So I said to him, do you have a gardener? Yes. Do you have a maid? Yes. Do you have a driver? Yes. Do you have a security guard? Yes. Do you have a cook? Yes. Do you have someone that collects your laundry? Yes. Ask them where they live. 2 days later I met him and he said, I see your point. All the people that he relied on, his quality of life, lived in the informal settlements. Most senior civil servants don't believe that. It needs a careful survey, strong data, to show them what is blindingly obvious to most people. The data can also serve to identify the key areas of environmental health risk in informal settlements, and I'll come to an example of that a little bit later. Of course, it's data that documents how people get water, how people get sanitation, what toilets they use. So it also provides the basis for designing better provision for water, better provision for sanitation, a better provision for solid waste collection. And of course, for every community within these surveys, suddenly they get data about themselves. And because it's them that has collected it, and them that has analysed it, it then provides them with the information base to discuss what to do in the future. So it's very powerful data for negotiation outside, but also for thinking about their future, what they want to do, what they want to invest in. And of course, data is something that usually governments hold, and governments control, and governments use. And if the data is produced by the grassroots organisations and federations, it kind of changes the understanding of it's no longer data from government to community, it's data from community to government. So just to give you some examples of this. The first thing you do when you're doing an enumeration and a mapping of an informal settlement is you have lots of meetings. Meet the village elders, meet the troublemakers, meet the politicians, meet the local land agency staff. Let everyone know what's going to happen. So that when a surveyor begins to go door to door, people know that it's going to happen, and they know why it's going to happen, and they know who's doing it. This doesn't remove all risk. There's been threats of death for people doing surveys, for instance, in Nairobi, but it enormously reduces the potential for these conflicts. You identify local people that become the people that do the survey. So again, it's not a stranger coming to someone's house, it's someone coming to their house that they know and they trust already. Usually it's the women that manage the savings groups that manage the enumerators, the people that go and collect the data. You go house to house and you record all the basic data for each house. You also take a digital camera with you and you take a photo of all the people that live there in front of their house and you allocate a number to each house. Usually you start with a chalk number so that if more households appear or you miss one or two households, you've got to change it. But it means that everyone then gets back an identity card with their photo in front of their house with their address. This is often the first official document they get. It's not a legal document. It's not provided by government. It's provided by the federations. But governments have come to trust the federations and to recognise this as legitimate documentation. You then return all the data to the community. So it isn't extracting the data, it's returning the data to them. And very often what you'll do is you'll put up summaries in the local meeting places that present all the data back. And of course, as you present the data back, so it's checked and double-checked and triple-checked. And of course, people lie, people cheat. If I'm living in a settlement, in a house with 7 people, all my family, I will claim that I've got 2 families, because you hope that's going to improve your chance of getting support. But as this returns to the women's savings groups, they say, no, so-and-so hasn't got 2 families, it's 1 family. And so you ground truth all the data. But you never get that ground truth thing if it's a formal survey done by outsiders. And then you use that data as the basis for discussions about what the community wants to do. And interviews don't take 20 minutes. Interviews take a long time. Interviews become almost a community discussion. This is in Pune, in India, where they're working in this incredibly high density informal settlement. And they've managed to negotiate the right to upgrade it, not to move it, which is a big breakthrough for Pune, big breakthrough for India. And they're doing the household survey. And everyone gathers round and contributes discussions. This woman up here, Satterthwaite. Satterthwaite is one of the key community leaders of the Federation. She's illiterate. She is the finest negotiator I have ever seen. I've sat with her in meetings, negotiating with national government for serious national funding, and she's the best negotiator I have ever seen. 5 years ago, Satterthwaite, if someone came into her community, which is an informal settlement, she'd hide in her sari. She didn't feel she had the right to talk to outsiders. Again, you see an amazing aspect of this federation's work. It finds amazing leaders and gives women opportunities they would never have under any other circumstance. So I'm going to look at two enumerations quickly. The first is in Kisumu, which is the third largest city in Kenya, done by the Kenya's Homeless People's Federation. They trained 780 community residents to be enumerators. It kind of gives you an idea of the scale of these operations. They covered all 70,000 households. All households got a photo card. This lists the way you can get more details. I presume your university has a subscription to Environment and Urbanization. But if it hasn't, it's open access for all but the two most recent years. So up to 2010, all papers are open access anyway. But I suspect that there is a formal subscription, which means that you then get everything. This is how you start off. You sit with some people that have been longest in the community, and in this instance, the elders, the elderly men, and draw a first draft map. So you begin to get a sense from local residents that have been there a long time how the settlement is organized. And you go house to house, and this is where you are beginning to do the house enumeration. And of course, each number is then recorded on a map. And the community enumerators bring the enumerations they've done back, look through them, check them, discuss with each other any particular problems or issues. And then the data is returned to the community, so residents can verify it, everyone can see it, keeping the whole process very transparent. And finally, what you get to is these sort of maps that develop eventually to identify everyone's plot size. And they become GIS in that if you hover the mouse over any of those particular plots, it'll give you the data of the household that's actually living there. The second one is the city of Cuttack in India. 600,000 inhabitants, 331 informal settlements. The city commissioner wanted to apply for Government of India funding, Central Government of India funding, for an upgrading program. But what he needed was a survey of all informal settlements to do so. And he knew that he couldn't do it. So he asked Mahila Milan, the Federation of Women Savings Groups, to do the surveys for him. It's an amazing city, Cuttack. I kid you not, the blue bits are water. It is a city surrounded by rivers that are enormous during the monsoon season. And there's terrible problems of flooding. What Cuttack has is it's an embankment that basically protects the central bits, but everyone who's on the wrong side of the embankment gets flooded. And they get flooded pretty much every year. And they get serious flooding every 3 to 5 years. You can't quite see me, I'm just outside the picture, but this is what they do is the women leaders, the Mahila leaders, the local leaders, will arrange for a settlement and say, we're going to come and visit you at a time that's convenient for you, to set a time. For this instance, I think 4 of us turned up. 2 Mahila leaders, 1 local NGO staff, and myself. And we arrived at this informal settlement where we were greeted with great courtesy, and taken to the house of the woman who managed the savings group, and given a cup of tea and chatted. And slowly, a group of savers who were from the community gathered with us, and we began to talk. Who lives here? How many people live here? When did you move? Where do you work? Who owns the land around you? Who owns your land? Then to get very specific, when were you hit by floods? How high did the floodwaters come? How long did they last? Where did you move to? Did you manage to save your livestock? Did you manage to save your possessions? How much damage was done to your home when you went back? Who supported you during the period when you had no income because of flood? Who supported you in terms of providing uncontaminated water? And in an hour and a half of these sort of questions, you built up an incredibly detailed picture, qualitative picture, of issues and conditions in this particular settlement. Then you walked around the boundary of the settlement with a GPS device being used by one of the community leaders. And you just click every 2 to 3 meters. And as you walked around the boundaries, so you can talk about who lives there, who owns that land, is this where the drainage is particularly bad? And, you know, within 4 hours, 4 people had actually amassed an incredibly detailed picture of conditions and trends and risks and vulnerabilities. And then you do exactly that same thing in 330 other informal settlements. And what you've got is an amazingly detailed picture of needs, priorities, risks, and vulnerabilities. You then gather the information that you took from those interviews and incorporate it into the digital maps, so that you, again, you have a digital map with all the informal settlements, to which all the details about each informal settlement is gathered. Now you've suddenly got, for local government, a map that covers all areas of the city, including the 331 informal settlements that didn't appear on official maps, with a very strong idea of where flooding happens, where it's most serious. And this has been produced really with not that much time. What you then do is that, let's go back to this. As you identify particular settlements where work is needed, you then go back and do the household survey. What you can see here is a separation of 2 things, the profile and the digital mapping, which is relatively quick and easy, which gives the city and the Federation a picture of where risk and vulnerability is. Then the strategic decisions made about where you're going to invest. And then in those areas, you go and do the very detailed household survey, household by household, plot by plot. There's no point in doing that plot by plot work until there's been a decision to actually do something, because it's much more time intensive. But I think this is pretty obvious. The advantages of the community-driven profiles and mapping is that they can be done very quickly. They engage those who are most at risk, and they engage those who have most local knowledge, which is what gives them their strength and their detail. It provides a citywide picture, so local government can be strategic. Then, so here is the basis for planning, development, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation together. Hurrah. Then you get to the nitty-gritty in each settlement, where you've got to identify every plot and every household. This is where you do the second methodology, the house numbering, and the house-to-house interviews. And this is just a picture of a layout plan for an informal settlement undergoing upgrading in Bhubaneswar. It's a city close to Cuttack. This is where it becomes a lot more time intensive. This is where you're negotiating with households. Please, can we have this much of your plot, this much of your plot, to allow a proper access road? We need to move you because we need to create open space here. Can we move you to here? All of this is done within the project boundaries. This isn't moving people out. It's accommodating everyone. But it's accommodating everyone and putting in the infrastructure. And this is slow and detailed and difficult and needs endless negotiation. The smaller your house or your plot, the more you're loath to lose, even 5%. So every household has to be brought into this negotiation process. I think that the only people that can do this are these women's savings groups. Every time professionals try to do this, they just come into too many conflicts and difficulties, and in the end the government imposes a solution. Generating the consensus for this is incredibly difficult, but it's something that the federations have demonstrated the capacity to do. And this is just a reminder of the incredible local knowledge. I was in Paradis, it's another city, it's a coastal city, in the same state as Orissa, the same state as Bhubaneswar and Cuttack. And I asked her about risk and vulnerability, and she drew me this map, and all those colour codes relate to different levels of risk, or different particular risks. She drew it in front of me. It took her about 30 minutes. It's just a reminder of the incredible knowledge base in these informal settlements, if you can tap them. I think I'm going over time, so there's a fantastic story to tell on the Philippines Homeless People's Federation. What they've basically done is they've learned to go to communities where there's been a disaster and make sure that those who are displaced get a decent deal in relocation, in rebuilding. And there's some mayors that have worked very closely with them, and you've had amazing partnerships between the Homeless People's Federation of the Philippines and mayors in identifying all the settlements at risk and reducing that risk, or finding locations that they want to move to improve their conditions. There's a working paper on this which you can download free. More stuff on the Philippines. Iloilo is one of the most interesting cities because that's where the mayor has worked very closely with the Homeless People's Federation. The mayor even allows the Federation representatives to sit on the budget committee and the land use planning committee. Now these are the two hottest committees in any successful city. It opens all the transactions of government on land use planning and management and how you allocate the budget to the scrutiny of the Homeless People's Federation. It's a great quote from Ruby Haddad, one of the community leaders. Payatas was an informal settlement built on a rubbish dump that was buried by a landslide in 2000. There's other fantastic examples, but again you go to the World's Best Journal and find the case study. This is a Pakistani NGO that worked with community organizations to map the whole city to identify how best to improve water and sanitation. And the very clever division, the government provided the trunk infrastructure, the big pipes. Communities provided the small pipes. And it was a very good division of labour, and it enormously cheapened the whole process. So communities were putting in the pipe water and digging the sewers and the drains, and the government was providing the trunk sewers, the trunk drains, and the trunk water supply that fed them and supported them. They also produced handbooks for politicians as they were elected, saying, look, you've got these funding for investment in your community, here's the best way to deliver water and sanitation. Another fantastic example, which I haven't got time to go into, the Asian Coalition for Community Action gave 1,000 communities small grants to address the thing that they prioritise themselves. Of course, no one ever gives the urban poor the right to make choices. Choices are always made by professionals, planners, architects, development specialists, engineers. What this did was to say any grassroots organisation, as long as it was representative, could draw up to $3,000 to do anything they thought would improve conditions. And there's 7 papers in this issue of Environment and Urbanisation that are an assessment of what they did. It was an amazing way to stimulate grassroots communities. And what it did too was in every city, it stimulated 7, 8, 9 or 10 of these. So 10 communities were innovating. 10 communities were talking to each other. 10 communities were federating to put pressure on local government to to drive government change. Again, you've got this picture of take the initiative, federate, talk to government, develop a partnership that you can work together. I think these are all pretty obvious. The scale of what was being achieved in India, they've enumerated over 8 million people living in informal settlements. That means 8 million people who are part of the official documentation. Remember in Cuttack how they covered 331 informal settlements through surveys, just with 3 to 4 hours in each. It didn't cost very much. Again, you're producing valuable data, but not with huge cost implications, and producing in a way that strengthens grassroots organizations. This is a triumph. Zimbabwe, one of the worst governments on the planet, one of the largest evictions in the planet in 2005, where 600, 700,000 people had their homes bulldozed. Some of the most rigid and inflexible local governments in the world, they're still sticking to British land use planning standards that were put in place during the colonial period. Absolute refusal to work with those informal settlements, absolute refusal to allow slum upgrading. The federations have changed that. It's taken 15 years. But this is Epworth, outside Harare. And what they've agreed to is that they can upgrade it incrementally. Hugely important. And that they've allowed the federation to manage the whole process. So here are just some of the maps that have been developed. All of this through a community survey. You begin to see how the community process, a very strong community process, is generating maps and generating data sets that local governments find useful. Indeed, they're far in advance, technically, of what local government already has. Some of the federations occasionally teach local government officials how to do GIS, which I find very fun. And you can also see the links between what the community generated at the outset and the final plans. Again, there's a case study that you can go to. I've already mentioned things that the federations do that go vastly beyond enumerations and mapping. Many nations have their own national urban poor fund, where they will put their savings, but also through which local government can support them, or external funders can support them. I've mentioned the precedent-setting initiatives they tried, community toilets, building houses. They formed their own international umbrella organization to put pressure on international agencies to change the way they function. They have their own International Urban Poor Fund. This is a fund through which $27 million is a lot of money, has been made available to the federations, but for projects they choose, and projects who are appraised by other federations. This is the first time that the urban poor federations have their own fund that they manage, that's accountable to them, that's transparent to them. None of the funding you get from international agencies ever comes like this. It's always someone else is making decisions. It's accountable upwards, not accountable downwards. And I could keep you here for at least another 4 hours talking about all the implications this has had. But it's changed national policy in Namibia. It's changed national policy and national funding streams in India. It's changed the way many cities operate. It's introduced new financial mechanisms that are accountable upwards to funders and downwards to those that use them. Okay, leave it at that. There's all these case studies are available on the enumerations and mapping if you want to. And I strongly recommend them.